When a snake twists a pregnant cat, a young woman who's been caring for the cat is horrified. She shouts for help, but look who came to the rescue. Martha screamed in horror. The huge snake was twisting the poor cat, and she had no idea what to do. Looking around for something to distract the snake or help loosen its grip, the young woman quickly wiped the tears from her eyes. She couldn't lose Lucy and her kittens now, but the snake was huge, and there was no way she could free the cat by herself. However, her scream caught the attention of an unlikely rescuer, and soon they would be on the scene to help save the pregnant cat. The cat and the rescuer would turn Martha's world upside down. The young woman had always loved animals, and one day she would adopt and rescue as many pets as she could. Right now, though, keeping a cat or dog in her tiny apartment wasn't fair, and it wasn't allowed either. Martha dreamed of the day when she'd have a beautiful house with a large backyard, and she'd be able to give animals a loving home. For now, though, the young woman had taken it upon herself to help some of the strays that populated her quiet neighborhood. There were a few cats who lived on the patch of deserted land just behind her street, and she'd started leaving bowls of food and water out for them. She was even in the process of looking for some small shelters so the cats had some shade from the intense Florida heat or the regular afternoon storms. Martha gathered up the cat biscuits and snacks from her kitchen and glanced out of the window. Mr. Watson was just leaving with his dog, a golden Labrador named Gunner, getting their walk in nice and early before it was too hot. Every time she saw the old man, her heart broke for him. He looked so lonely, but no matter how much she tried, she never got more than a gruff "good morning" or "good afternoon" from him, and only if she spoke first. Martha and Mr. Watson had moved to the neighborhood around the same time, and at first, she'd found him to be incredibly rude. However, her upstairs neighbor, who somehow knew everything about everyone, told her that she'd heard that the old man had moved from Colorado, where his son had been part of a mountain rescue team. He'd been out on a particularly dangerous rescue and had sadly lost his life. Gunner had been the young man's rescue dog, and the pair had worked alongside each other for a while. Mr. Watson had adopted the dog as a last link to his son. When Martha heard the story, she'd seen Mr. Watson in a whole new light. Still, it didn't matter how friendly she was. He never wanted to stop and talk. Gunner was a sweet dog, though, and she understood that both the old man and the dog must deeply miss the person they'd loved. She gathered up everything she was taking for the stray cats as Mr. Watson passed by her building, and she sighed heavily. It was a hot August day, and even though it was only early in the morning, the air was already sticky and humid. As she crossed over the road, Martha began to grow concerned for one of the strays, the one she'd named Lucy. She was a sweet, sleek black cat who was heavily pregnant when she'd first appeared on the land with a round belly. The young woman had been shocked. She'd tried several times before to get the strays taken into shelters, but it was always the same story. Everywhere was full, and there was little the shelters could do. Martha had no idea what she would do when the cat had her kittens, even though she knew she'd do her best to take care of the cat. The wasteland was no place for a new mom and her kittens. Martha began to empty the cat biscuits into the bowls she dotted around the land and noted that she hadn't spotted Lucy yet. It was unusual for her to go far now she was so heavily pregnant, and usually, she was the first one over, wanting a stroke when the young woman started dishing out the food. She was definitely the most loving of the 4 strays that Martha fed. Every time she saw the poor little black cat, she wished she could take her home. The young woman hoped that Lucy hadn't hidden herself away somewhere to give birth. Searching around in the bushes, there was no evidence of the little cat, and Martha vowed to wait a while and return. Luckily, she worked from home, so she had the luxury of being able to tend to the cats on a regular schedule. For the next few hours, Martha found that she couldn't concentrate on her work. She was too worried about Lucy potentially giving birth on such a hot day. She closed her laptop and pulled on her shoes. She needed to go and look for the cat again. Her mind wouldn't be at ease until she found her. On her way out, she passed Mr. Watson, who looked like he was returning from the store. She hurriedly said good afternoon as she crossed over the road and heard the usual gruff reply from behind her. But Mr. Watson had never known the young woman to be in such a hurry. Ever since he'd moved, he'd been trying to avoid a conversation with her almost daily. She was persistent, he'd give her that, but he was never in the mood to talk to anyone, and he'd always brushed her off. He wondered if she'd finally given up trying to get him to talk. Mr. Watson unlocked his front door and dropped down his grocery bag. Gunnar came trotting into the hallway to greet him, and the old man bent down to give the loyal dog an ear tickle. Since his son had passed away, the dog was just about the only thing in the world that the old man cared for. The two had a shared grief. They both had lost the same person, and there wasn't a day that went by where they didn't miss him. Carl had been the old man's whole world from the moment he was born to the moment he died, and now he was lost without him. The two had been extremely close, not just father and son but best friends too. When Carl passed, his world had shattered, and he felt like he'd aged another 20 years just in the past few months. When the search and rescue team told him that Gunnar wouldn't perform his duties properly with Carl gone, the old man immediately offered to adopt him. It was the only link he had left to his son, and he had grown to love the dog. The old man and the dog had moved to Florida shortly after because he couldn't stand stepping out of the house every day and seeing the mountains that had claimed his son. He had no other family and didn't even bother telling his friends where he was moving to. He just wanted to be alone with his grief, which is why he found Martha particularly annoying. She was always pleasant and cheery, no matter how much he tried to push her away. Telling a neighbor he hardly knew that he was so wrapped up in grief that the only reason he got out of bed in the morning was for the dog was hardly a good conversation starter. Martha's hurried good afternoon to him was the first time she hadn't tried to stop for a longer conversation, and Mr. Watson didn't know how to feel. Climbing the stairs, Mr. Watson looked out of his bedroom window. The deserted land and the nearby lake were his only view, but when he saw the young woman frantically searching on the land, he frowned. He'd seen her over there before and was sure that she fed some stray cats that lived there, but her actions seemed different today, like she was worried about something. He stepped away from the window. What she was up to wasn't any of his business. He wasn't about to start getting involved with his neighbors now. He went back downstairs and opened the door to his backyard so Gunnar could stretch his legs. Thankfully, his backyard was big, and half of it was still in the shade, so the dog could avoid the strong sunshine. Little did he know that he would soon have to break his own rules on speaking to his neighbors. It didn't matter where she looked. Martha couldn't find Lucy anywhere. She was really worried now. It was really out of character for the little cat, and she couldn't help but feel like something bad had happened. Suddenly, a scuffling noise followed by a meek meow stopped the young woman in her tracks. She listened carefully, trying to determine which direction the noise had come from. She hurriedly followed it, but when she finally found the source of the noise, she screamed in horror. A snake was twisting itself around the cat she'd been searching for. Lucy couldn't move, and it was obvious that all the fight was quickly leaving her body. Martha had no idea what to do. The snake was huge, and although pythons weren't venomous, the young woman simply wasn't strong enough to tackle the big snake on her own. Panicking, Martha began to cry. If she didn't do something soon, the snake would claim Lucy and her kittens. She couldn't lose the little cat now. She either had to distract the snake so it would loosen its grip or find something to help free the cat. She looked around, but there was nothing in sight. Martha couldn't leave the cat to fetch help, so she did the only thing she could think to do and began to shout for help as loudly as she could. Her cries would soon be heard by an unlikely rescuer. Back in Mr. Watson's yard, Gunnar had just found himself a nice patch of shade to stretch out in when he heard a scream. He sat up, alert and listening for further sounds. When he heard a young woman shouting, he began to bark in response. Mr. Watson stopped putting his groceries away and looked out of the window. Gunnar wasn't one to make a fuss and rarely barked at anything, but now he seemed on edge. The old man didn't think he'd ever seen the dog behave like that. He went to the door and shouted Gunnar over, but the usually obedient dog ignored him and carried on barking. Something had definitely spooked him. Mr. Watson walked over to Gunnar and tried to soothe him. At the touch of his hand, the dog quieted down and looked at the old man as if he was trying to tell him something. But now that the dog had stopped barking, he too could hear the cry for help that seemed to be coming from the deserted land behind his home. For a brief moment, the old man wasn't sure what to do, but when he looked at Gunnar again, he knew the pair of them needed to help whoever was shouting. Slipping on the dog's harness, they left the house with Gunnar leading the way. For the first time, Mr. Watson was seeing what Gunnar must have been like as a search and rescue dog. He was focused and diligent, just as his son Carl had been. It was no wonder they made such a good pair. Although it pulled at his heartstrings, it also filled his heart with pride. Martha's voice was quickly going hoarse, but it seemed that her shouting had momentarily stunned the snake, who had stopped twisting the pregnant cat. She could see that Lucy was still breathing, but the poor cat had gone very still. Her body was almost entirely wrapped in the snake's coil. Now, though, Martha was alerted to another noise. She could hear a dog barking. The young woman dared to hope that someone had heard her cries. The snake had heard the barking too and seemed on high alert. Suddenly, Martha worried about what it would do if it felt threatened. The snake began to hiss aggressively as the barking got closer. The young woman wiped the tears from her eyes and tried to compose herself just as Mr. Watson and Gunnar came into view. She couldn't believe it. Of all the people to come to the rescue, she never expected to see the old man. But then she remembered that Gunnar had once been a search and rescue dog. The intelligent animal must have heard her cries and tracked her down. If the pair were shocked by the sight of a snake twisting a pregnant cat, they didn't show it. Mr. Watson picked up a large stick from the ground as Gunnar pulled at his harness. Soon the dog was face to face with the snake, and Martha looked on in awe at what he and the old man did next. Letting go of Gunnar's harness, the old man began to wave the stick at the snake, while the dog angrily barked and growled at the wild animal. Having a man and a dog to deal with, the snake quickly forgot about the cat it had in its grip, and Martha watched as it began to untwist itself. The grip it had on Lucy's body loosened. Seizing the opportunity, Martha dove forward and grabbed Lucy. The snake lunged at Gunnar, but the dog expertly dodged the snake's sharp teeth as Mr. Watson swung the stick through the air, neutralizing the snake. Martha held Lucy close to her and wept. Thankfully, the little cat was still breathing and didn't seem to be in too much pain. The young woman just hoped the kittens were okay. It was all too much for her. The thought of losing Lucy or the kittens, the fact that Mr. Watson had been the one to help, the way Gunnar had bravely taken on the snake. She sobbed uncontrollably. Without saying a word, Mr. Watson took the young woman by the arm and guided her back to his house. By the time they got there, Lucy was purring softly, and the old man took the little cat and laid her on a blanket before fetching her a bowl of water and some chicken. Next, he handed Martha a sugary coffee to help with her shock. When Martha had composed herself, she couldn't stop thanking Mr. Watson. She made a huge fuss of Gunnar, who just seemed to be taking everything in his stride as though it had just been a regular day for him. But what Mr. Watson told her next shocked the young woman even more. He told her that he would take care of Lucy until she gave birth. Gunnar seemed completely unfazed by the cat, and the old man said he had a spare room that he could set up as a quiet spot for Lucy to give birth. When the kittens were old enough, he told Martha he'd help her find loving homes for them all. Martha felt like she was going to cry all over again. Twisting her hands in her lap, she desperately wanted to ask Mr. Watson something, but she had no idea how he would react. In the last few hours, he had transformed into someone completely different. Even Lucy seemed to instantly warm to him, curling up on his lap and softly snoozing. She thankfully seemed to have already forgotten about her encounter with the snake, but the old man had always kept to himself. She decided she had nothing to lose and asked him if he'd like to come over for dinner the next day as her way of thanking him for all his help. Mr. Watson was about to turn down the invitation to dinner when he stopped himself. These last few hours were the first time in a long time that he'd felt useful and not completely consumed by his grief. Would it really be so bad if he had dinner in the young woman's apartment? For the first time since he'd moved, he accepted an invitation. Maybe it was about time he stopped shutting himself off from the world. If that afternoon had taught him anything, it was that he still had a place in the world, and there were still people who cared about him. Now, not only did he have a loyal dog to get out of bed for, but he also had a loving cat and a kind and caring young woman who someday might just become a friend. Now it's over to you. How would you have felt in Martha's position? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.